For most of the 20th century, India and China refused to recognize each other's claims on mountains and passes stretching 500 miles along the Himalayas. There have been battles and skirmishes numerous times, but in the past 4 decades, no lives were lost. Until earlier this week. It happened on Monday high in the Ladakh region after a month-long standoff along the disputed border, marked here in yellow, which is known as the Line of Actual Control. Now, this was a skirmish between two major regional powers, two nuclear nations, but the fighting wasn't with guns, rockets, or other modern weapons. In fact, no shots were reportedly fired. Instead, the deadliest battle between the two sides in 45 years was with fists, sticks, and rocks. Well, no fists were seen today. Instead, an Indian Army convoy was spotted headed for the disputed region. At the same time, Chinese and Indian foreign ministers agreed to de-escalate tensions, both countries promising to disengage troops and to restore calm. Well, despite intense diplomacy, there were bellicose tones from India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi. He said the country would be proud to learn the soldiers had died fighting for India. And he said, if provoked, India is capable of defending itself.
An Indian protester smashes Chinese-made phones. Angry anti-China demonstrations broke out across India after the worst border clash in over 40 years, resulting in a mutual blame game. India says 20 soldiers were killed in hand-to-hand combat high in the Himalayan mountains. They fought in the dark, it says, armed only with rocks, some soldiers plunging to their deaths in sub-zero temperatures. India blames Beijing, accusing Chinese soldiers of intruding on its territory. China says the opposite. But amid nationwide outrage, India's nationalist Prime Minister was under pressure to respond aggressively. He vowed that the soldiers will not have died in vain. India wants peace, but if provoked, we are capable of giving an appropriate response. For its part, China blames India. Beijing says Indian forces violated its territory. The conflict arose in a region in the Himalayas where an exact border has never been agreed. Infrastructure projects on both sides of the disputed line of control have increased tension in recent months. Now India is sending more troops to join the hundreds already stationed in the Ladakh region. Both sides well know the risks of a further escalation. After a phone conversation between their foreign ministers, Beijing emphasized attempts to defuse the situation. China and India both expressed that they want to solve differences through dialogue to maintain the peace and stability of the border region. This standoff has dramatically raised the stakes between these nuclear-armed superpowers, making a de-escalation in the region even more urgent.
All right, for more, we want to bring in Kyle Gardner tonight. He's a specialist in South Asian affairs. He spent a year in the Himalayas in Kashmir conducting research. His upcoming book is called The Frontier Complex, Geopolitics and the Making of the India-China Border. Kyle joins me tonight from Washington, D.C. Kyle, welcome to the day. This status quo along the border, it has been tolerated by China and India for a long time. You lived in the Kashmir region. How explosive is it there, and what's changed?
Well, thanks for having me. I would have said a week ago that very little has changed. This spring's events have been, I think, on a scale which is larger than previous summers, but in many ways, this is sadly a typical pattern when the weather warms up. It's a very cold region. The activities of the military on both sides, whether it's repairing roads or building new ones, tends to take place over the short summer months. However, with the events on Monday and as you noted earlier on the program, the first loss of life in 45 years, I think this has taken a very serious turn.
Well, the soldiers, we understand, used bare fists, sticks, and stones against each other. I mean, that does not sound like either side has been seriously preparing for a confrontation. How do you read it?
No, and in fact, there have been a number of bilateral agreements going back, particularly in the 90s and 93 and 96, that specified that there would be no use of weapons. And so when these fights do break out, and they have with some regularity in recent summers, they tend to be with rocks and fists. And disturbingly, we heard from reports on Monday the use of some sort of studded weapons and things like that.
Well, what do you think? What could make a fist fight blow up into a full-fledged war?
Well, I think both sides are very very cautious because they know that the stakes are high, and I think that unfortunately we're dealing with a somewhat unusual situation this summer globally, but with the pandemic, but also you're dealing with two countries that are in the midst of different crises, two leaders who I think are prone to taking advantage of nationalist rhetoric and want to stand firm in the eyes of their citizens. And so I think the risk here is certainly higher than in years past of this growing, not wanting to stand down on either side and appear weak.
There is a lot of talk about a new Cold War now between the U.S. and China, and that puts India in a position where it has to choose, and of course it would choose the United States. If this were to become a serious conflagration, what is the risk of this becoming a proxy war between China and the U.S.? Do you see that risk being significant?
There is certainly a risk there, and despite trade tensions between the U.S. and India, I think it's absolutely fair to say that U.S.-India relations have grown warmer and closer, particularly in terms of defense. That said, also U.S.-China relations are growing colder. So I think there's no doubt that there's no doubt where the U.S. falls in this dispute, and statements that have come out in recent weeks from various U.S. officials have supported that. President Trump tweeted a couple of weeks ago that he would be willing to mediate, which is something that neither side wants. But I think there certainly is a risk of this becoming a larger geopolitical issue.
You mentioned the coronavirus pandemic. I mean, what role does it play here? There has been talk that for the past 2 months, China had no new cases of infections and was not distracted by the virus, and therefore became emboldened to act along the border. India, of course, has been dealing with ever increasing numbers of infections. Is the coronavirus, is it playing a big role here?
That's a good question, and I think one that, at best we can maybe speculate that it is playing a role, although I'm not exactly sure, and I think it would be unfair at this point to sort of speculate how exactly. Certainly, though, both countries' economies have taken serious hits, and while China is further along the road to recovery, India, as you rightly point out, is seeing daily increases in spikes. I think just in the past 24 hours, they've hit a new record with something like 2,000 reported deaths, and I think they're now fourth behind the U.S., Brazil, and Russia in total cases. So I think it's certainly a factor, but how exactly that is playing into the calculus of these governments, I don't know.
Okay. Kyle Gardner, specialist in South Asian affairs and a visiting fellow at George Washington University, joining us from Washington, D.C. tonight. Kyle, we appreciate your insights. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Well, the world is watching nervously as India and China clash over that disputed border. But can Germany play a role in easing tensions and mediating here? Earlier tonight, DW's Rosalia Romanich put that question to Germany's foreign minister, Heiko Maas.
These are two large countries, and I don't want to begin to think about the conflict that could happen if this results in a real military escalation. That's why we are trying at all levels, on both sides, to bring about de-escalation. What's your message to both sides, and how can Germany mediate? I don't think that Germany needs to get involved everywhere as a mediator. But we are sitting on the UN Security Council, and we will take on the presidency in July. I believe the expectation in the international community is that countries like India and China should not get embroiled in a conflict that would not only affect those two nations, but also the entire region. And that's why we are doing what we can to influence both sides with a clear message to de-escalate this conflict and avoid a further escalation, especially a military one.